Lambda. The lambda expression has the following syntax. Lambda formal parameters body. The keyword lambda is followed by a list of arguments 0 or more and a body. A lambda expression evaluates to a procedure which can be applied to appropriate arguments. When the procedure is applied, the arguments are bound to the corresponding values and the body is evaluated. Lambda expressions return a procedure. Let's start by creating a procedure taking one argument and returning the argument multiplied by 2. Now we have to provide it with an argument. For an example 5. This is done in the following way. We can also bind the procedure to a name just as we did earlier with define. We write the procedure square using lambda would result in the following. So, what is the difference between binding the procedure using lambda and using define? The answer is simple. Practically none. These two are exactly the same. In here, we will describe the most important differences between Scheme and Common Lisp. Size of the language. Common Lisp is a large language compared to Scheme, and that is good. Many things in Common Lisp that are missing in Scheme are features that are frequently needed by many programmers. Having these features standardized is a good thing, as opposed to having to add them, often in an ad hoc way, for each application. Some of these features include packages, arrays, structures, hash tables, object-oriented programming features, a powerful Markov feature for extending the language, generalized assignment, and much more. Numbers. The Scheme specification allows an implementation of Scheme to have very little support for numbers. In fact, it would be acceptable to have only floating point numbers and still call in Scheme. Common Lisp by construct requires every implementation to support floating point numbers, rational numbers, integers of arbitrary precision, complex floating point number, and complex rational numbers. This fact makes programmers that use numbers more portable. Tail call optimization. In Scheme, tail calls must be optimized by the compiler so that no additional stack space is consumed. Thus, in Scheme, iteration is a special case of tail recursion. You can count on the Scheme compiler or interpreter to convert tail calls to simple jumps. No such rule exists in Common Lisp, although many Common Lisp compilers actually do optimize tail calls. It is therefore less frequent in Common Lisp to use tail recursion for traversing lists. Instead, Common Lisp has a rich set of iteration primitives for exactly that purpose. Program data equivalence. A major problem with Scheme that does not exist in Common Lisp is that the Scheme language does not define an internal representation for programs, although to be fair, all Scheme implementations do. Common Lisp, on the other hand, does require two such forms to be equivalent. This feature is the very basis of Common Lisp macro system, which uses Lisp data to represent and manipulate Lisp code. Since no such equivalence exists in Scheme, one can argue that it is impossible to ever have a good macro system for Scheme. In practice, of course, nearly all implementations do define the equivalence and do contain macro systems.
Multiple namespaces. The difference that is perhaps the most difficult for students to get used to is the fact that Common Lisp global function names are different from names of other data objects. We say that Common Lisp has multiple namespaces, whereas Scheme has a single namespace. The main idea in Common Lisp is that the name func in an expression such as fun arg is treated differently from the name arg. simply because it is the first sub-expression of a function call. Instead of using the normal value of the variable fun, its function value is used. In normal circumstances, this works the same as scheme. However, as soon as something slightly more complicated is attempted, the difference is visible. Perhaps the most obvious difference is that in Common Lisp, it is possible to use the name of a function as an ordinary value without shadowing the function. This is possible in Common Lisp, but not in Scheme. Minor variations in syntax. There are some minor differences in syntax between Scheme and Common Lisp. To define a procedure in Scheme, you would use the define, whereas in Common Lisp, you would use the defun, special form with slightly different syntax. Other differences exist like set exclamation in Scheme and set q in Common Lisp, and map in Scheme, which does not correspond to the Common Lisp function with the same name, but instead to the Common Lisp function map_car. What is the difference between Scheme and Common Lisp? Scheme is a dialect of Lisp that stresses conceptual elegance and simplicity. It is specified in R4RS and IEEE standard P1178. Scheme is much smaller than Common Lisp. The specification is about 50 pages compared to Common Lisp's 1300-page draft standard. Scheme is often used in computer science curricular and programming language research due to its ability to represent many programming abstractions with its simple primitives. In Common Lisp, a simple program would look something like the following. In Scheme, the equivalent program would like this. Experienced Lisp programmers might write this program as follows in order to allow it to run in constant space. Whereas in Scheme, the same computation could be written as follows.